Auntie Claus, written and illustrated by Elise Primavera. Hey Wilson friends, Mrs. Armstrong here with you, and I'm back today to bring you the second part of Auntie Claus. Before we finish the story, let's review what we read last time. When we left off, Sophie had just landed in a box that she had stowed away in from Auntie Claus's apartment in New York City. And as she crawled out of the box, she meets Mr. Pudding. And Mr. Pudding says that there's only 48 days left. Any predictions? Where do you think Sophie's at? And 48 days left until what? Remember, our theme in our story is also giving and receiving. Let's finish Auntie Claus and find out 48 days until what? Who's giving? Who's receiving? Mr. Pudding put Sophie right to work in the mailroom. It seemed to her as good a place as any to begin her search. Where was Auntie Claus, and what was she doing here? For days, Sophie lived among the elves, and she did her best to blend in. She slept on the cot in the elf dormitory. She ate her meals in the cafeteria. No one suspected. Every day, Mr. Pudding appeared. "Hello, Elf Sophie. Settling in?" he asked. "This uniform is itchy, and the hours are long," said Sophie. "This is hard work." Oh dear, said Mr. Pudding. He pulled the old green and red book from his pocket. "Elf rule number 2, Mr. Pudding recited. "An elf's work is never done, and hard work never hurt anyone." Rules schmools, thought Sophie. For weeks, Sophie looked high and low for Auntie Claus, but now it was almost Christmas Eve, and she had turned up nothing. Sophie was worried. If she didn't find Auntie Claus, how would she get home? If she didn't get home, how would I get all my Christmas presents? She thought. Just then, Mr. Pudding appeared. "Hello, Elf Sophie," he said. "Good news! You have excelled in the mailroom and may now proceed to package wrapping. And after that, we'll all pitch in on sleigh packing." "I'm not going to package wrapping, and I'm not going to sleigh packing. I want to go home," Sophie yelled. "I have to get all of my—" But before she could finish, Santa's voice interrupted over the PA system. "It's that time of year again," his voice boomed. "And I was hoping that one of you would volunteer to go down to the coal mines and pick up the BB&G list." Sophie whispered to Mr. Pudding, "What's the BB&G list?" "BB&G," he shivered, "is short for bad boys and girls. Any boy or girl on that list goes without presents, or worse, for Christmas." Sophie swallowed hard. "Oh no," she thought. Mr. Pudding continued, "Only the bravest elf would volunteer for such an awful job." Yes, a brave elf, thought Sophie, or else a girl who thinks she might be on the list. She raised her hand high. "I'll go," she said. Oh dear, Mr. Pudding said. As Sophie made her way towards the coal mines, she could hear the chanting of the BB&G elves. "Spoiled brats and cry babies, whiny babies, and all the ones who don't believe. Here's some coal and here's some gunk. Fill a stocking that smells like skunk." Sophie went down, where it became darker and darker. Finally, she reached the very bottom, and there was the list. Sophie looked for her name, but it wasn't her name that she saw on the list. It was my own little brat of a brother, she cried. Chris is on the bad boy and girl list? Well, she thought, once she got past the shock of it. They do kind of have a point. But then she pictured the two of them on Christmas morning. There'd be lots of presents for her and nothing for her little brother. On his favorite day of the year, Chris would only find a stinky stocking that was filled with coal and gunk. He'll be so disappointed. He'll be so sad, Sophie said. She quickly erased his name, but now there was a large telltale gap. There was only one thing to do. Sophie took a deep breath and wrote down her own name instead. The ink wasn't even dry on the page when some kind of really strong magic happened. Right before her eyes, the list, the BB&G elves, and the coal mines vanished. And Sophie was whirling around and around, hurling through the air in a blur of Christmas red and green. Was she up? Was she down? Sophie was standing on the stage in the grand ballroom, and a clock struck midnight. Santa began to speak. "She's always on time. She works harder than anyone I know, including me. Ho, ho, ho. In short, she does things right and I'd be lost without her. Let's have a big round of applause for my sister." The curtain opened up. "Auntie Claus?" Sophie shouted. "Auntie Claus!" Everybody cheered. "Hooray for Auntie Claus!" Turning to Sophie, Auntie Claus winked and said, "Come along now, darling. You must get home in time for Christmas." Sophie was about to climb onto the sleigh when Mr. Pudding appeared. He was waving his green and red book in the air. Oh dear, he cried. "Auntie Claus, Sophie can't leave until she knows the first and final rule. See? It says so right here under departing procedures." The reindeer stomped restlessly and shook their heads as if to say, "Let's go, let's go." "Sophie knows the first and final rule, Mr. Pudding," Auntie Claus said. "I do?" said Sophie. "Yes, you do. Now hop up onto the sleigh. There's a good girl." Sophie jumped into the sleigh, and it rose up into the sky. "Goodbye, goodbye," she called. She could barely hear her aunt's voice over the wind and the snow. "I knew you had it in you. Merry Christmas, darling." The sleigh picked up speed. "Ho, ho, ho!" Santa laughed as the stars whizzed by. Sophie closed her eyes and her face stung with the cold. When Sophie opened her eyes, she could hardly believe she was in her own bed again. She ran down the stairs towards the living room. "Please let him get his presents," she whispered to herself. Under the tree was her little brother. His cheeks were red, his eyes sparkled, and his belly shook with laughter. "Merry Christmas, Sophie!" he bellowed. "Merry Christmas, Chris," Sophie said with great relief. It was then that she realized Auntie Claus was right. "I do know the first and final rule." She said it to herself. It is far better to give than to receive. "There's something here for you," her mother and father said proudly. They handed Sophie a tiny box with a card. Inside was a diamond key hanging from a red ribbon. "It's from Auntie Claus," Sophie said. "Where is Auntie Claus anyway?" Chris piped up. "On a business trip, darling," Sophie said and smiled mysteriously. Suddenly, a thought occurred to Chris. "She's never here on Christmas," he said. "What kind of business is she in anyway?" "That is something for me to know and for you to find out," Sophie said to her little butterball of a brother. And someday he would. But that's another story. "For my dear niece Sophie, You really are a chip off of the old block. Love, Auntie Claus. P.S. I'll be expecting you for tea on Valentine's Day, darling.